You finished your novel. Maybe you've been working on this novel for years, or maybe you dashed off 50,000 words during National Novel Writing Month in November. You want your story to finally be shared with the world. First of all, congratulations. It is a huge deal to finish even the first draft of a book. But I want to caution you from rushing to submit that novel to publishers and literary agents before a rigorous revision process. Revision is not the same as spell check or a quick grammar fix. Revision is not light work. Revision means reimagining what the novel might become. It means rewriting what is not up to par. It means writing a whole lot more and then deleting a whole lot more words. What I don't want to do is mislead you and think, okay, time to go in and fix some commas. When you go in to just fiddle and fidget with words, that work is important, but it's far down the road. There is still a long journey of revision ahead. And for this reason, I'm going to be sharing over the next few days a 10-part video series all about how to revise your novel. So if you're in that place where you're ready to jump into draft 2 and get into revision, give me a follow and let's go on that journey together. Okay, so maybe you just finished the novel, like you hit the end and you wrote the end, which are magical words, and I know you want to jump into revision right now, but I want to caution you to wait like 1, maybe 2 months. No, seriously, like 1 or 2 months. Wait, just let it sit for just a little while. Your story needs time to breathe, to marinate. When you have just finished a novel, your relationship to that story is just too close, and that mars the revision process. You are just not able to be as objective as you need to be. You know, when you're first writing that draft, when you're just drafting, you do so with abandon and chaos. But when you approach the second draft, when you approach the revision process, you need to come at it with a more critical eye. And remember also that writing a novel is a marathon, so take the time to rest, to read, to maybe finally catch up on all of those cool Netflix shows that you've been ignoring for like 2 years. I suggest that you take anywhere from 1 to 3 months. And you know, if you're like the type of person who can't not write, work on something else. Work on some short fiction. If you're a novel writer, try out some poetry, or try writing a short play, or just, you know, address the towering to-be-read pile on your bedside table. And then, when you finally return to the work, your head won't be cluttered with all of the ways that you've romanticized your own first draft. You'll come at it and think, well, hey, who wrote this? And that might be a very critical part of you. That's a part you want to push out of you when you're writing the first draft. But when the second draft comes along, now open up that door. Come on in, critical self. It's time to sit down and have a chat. We're talking about how to revise your novel. You have finished the first draft, you've taken some time off, and now you're finally returning to the page. And I know what you want to do. You want to take that first sentence and you want to tweak it. You want to fix it. You want to fix all of the sentences, but I want you to stop. I want you to halt and listen. And I know you're thinking, what are you talking about? You revise a book the same way that you write it, 1 sentence at a time. No! I don't want you to fidget. Don't just change some words here and there. I want you to be bold. Be bold in your revision process. Be courageous. You should go big. You are not here to pencil in commas or fix typos. You are here to restructure and reimagine what your novel might become. This might require some serious rewrite. So what I want you to do before you even touch that first sentence and, you know, start changing the first chapter is sit down with your book, maybe print it out, and read it front to back. And it's gonna be painful. You're gonna wanna have a pencil in your hand and you're gonna wanna, you know, fix every typo. But instead, what I want you to do with that pencil is just take notes. Pay attention to where the story is taking you. What is happening in this story, and how might you imagine the story differently? Maybe the plot is totally different. Maybe you think, you know what, this character who's telling the story isn't very interesting, but the side character, now that's an interesting character. These are the sort of big changes that you will notice if you just sit down and read. Take the time to read what you have done and then think about the big changes that you want to make. The biggest two questions to ask is, one, what works here and how might you expand those elements, and what isn't working here and how can you get rid of those elements of your story. And now I'm going to say something that's going to sound super radical. The best revision, that second draft, the best thing you can do is a complete and total rewrite. I mean, start from scratch. This is what I mean by reimagination. We are working from the ground up. And now you understand why you don't want to touch that first sentence, because the first sentence, how it's arranged, doesn't really matter, because you know how to revise, and revision starts from the foundation. I know the number one advice that you get for revising a novel is cut. It's time to go into your book and delete entire chapters, sentences, characters, just get rid of everything. But I think this is really bad advice for the first revision. In fact, I think that you should focus on expansion rather than reduction. I think that the idea that you just go to a totally rough draft and come at it with scissors and start cutting it up is totally reductive, because you just don't have enough material. Think about a collage. You know, if you want to make a collage, what do you got to do? You got to get the materials. You got to cut out all of those cool pictures to make it into a cool collage. But you can't do that if you don't have the images and the magazines in front of you. So before you can do all the cutting, you have to be the one to actually create the raw material. Think that, like, you know, you're a sculptor, and you know what sculptors do? They take that marble block and they sculpt it down into something beautiful, but you are not a sculptor, you're a writer, which means that you don't start with any marble. You gotta make the marble yourself, and that's the next part of the process. And I think a common mistake that people make is that they think, well, hey, that first draft that I did, that's the marble, and now it's time to cut it down. But what you want in your revision are many choices. Do you know what the story might have been if it was written in past tense rather than present tense? What might have the story been like if it was written from the point of view of the dog instead of the dog owner? Sure, you can imagine all of those things, but you cannot know until you write them. Once you write them, once you've expanded your ideas and written more and more possibilities of what your novel can be, then comes time to do the choosing of which version works better. So before you go through your material and start striking it out and sifting through it and refining, you want to actually take time to gather enough material so that once you do the cutting, you are left with only the good parts. Lasagna has layers. Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Your novel in progress also has layers. I want to introduce you to the Lasagna Method of revision. It's also known as the draft method or the layers method, but I, as a major Garfield stan, choose to call it the Lasagna Method. Sometimes when you're revising a novel, you get hung up on the small stuff. It seems like such a huge task that you just want to fix commas instead of look at the bigger picture. With the Lasagna Method, you tackle these issues one layer at a time. You begin with the hearty good stuff, that pasta, and you know, at the end you're just sprinkling on the spices and that gooey crown of congealed melty cheese. So layer one, what are the major problems with your work? We're talking about structure, plot, and characters. Identify these by reading your work and then focus just on these. Put on your blinders and focus just on these elements. And then what you're gonna do, once you get through that draft, once you've completely revised your novel, you're gonna go back to the beginning and you're gonna do it again, and you're going to focus on a different element. Maybe the first time you just look at plot. Maybe the second time you just revise for characters. After a while, once you get to like the 14th layer or the 14th draft, you're going to be just looking at your word choice or your sentence structure, but that way you have already created the base, the foundation that you need for those smaller choices to matter. Is this method time consuming? Yes. Is this method effective? Yes. And if you are like me and you need structure, this process will give you some scaffolding that you can use to revise your novel. Okay, now it's time to actually endure rewriting the novel. And while you're doing that, here are some questions that you should ask. Number one, do you want to maintain the plot that you've written, or do you want to shrink it, or do you want to expand it to explore something completely different? Two, do you want to tell this story from your protagonist's point of view, or from the POV of another character? A good way to decide that is to ask yourself, well, does the protagonist experience a major shift? Is the action happening to them or to someone else? Three, how close is the POV? Are we just describing their actions, or are we really in close describing their inner thoughts? Four, does the story have clear stakes, and are those stakes resolved by the end of the story? In other words, are the questions posed at the beginning of your book answered by the end of the book? Of course, if you're writing a series, it's totally okay to leave some questions dangling, but the central questions must be answered, or else the reader's going to be pretty disappointed. Five, does your plot make logical sense? Are your characters making decisions that the reader looks at and says, yeah, you know what, I can understand why they would make that decision? So these are just some of the first questions that you should ask yourself to fill in the gaps during the first rewrite of your novel. We are talking about structure, and I've said the word structure many times, and you're probably wondering, what are you talking about? We're talking about linear structure and the lack thereof. The typical narrative arc has rising action that ends in a climax and then a denouement. The typical story also occurs in linear fashion. This happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. I actually suggest writing the first draft in linear fashion so you actually understand the plot of your own book, but after that, have fun! Mix it up! It can be a lot of fun, and it's something that authors employ often in order to create a little bit of tension, mystery, and dramatic irony. Sometimes that means jumping back in time, you know, this is Tuesday, but then this happened Monday, but then this happened Saturday, but this also happened Tuesday, but I didn't tell you about it yet. Or maybe it takes place in two different eras, like, hey, you know, these chapters are set in the 1920s, baby, and these chapters are set in the 2010s. I don't know why I acted like a robot, but I feel like 2010s are much like robots because of tech, but whatever, there's tons of things you can do. You can even switch out the characters and tell it from different point of views in each chapter. But having said that, be careful if you do that each voice of the character is unique and compelling. But we're not really here to talk about any of that. We're here to talk about structure. And the key thing to understand about your novel structure is that it should help your novel's readability rather than hinder it. It should improve your novel rather than make it just like more confusing and longer and more self-indulgent. So don't be afraid to jump into experimental structures. In fact, these are some books that explore experimental structures that I really love. But most importantly, use the structure that works best for your work. Hi, so you are a writer revising your novel, and I'm a writer helping you revise your novel. Let's talk about revising characters. Really often, writers don't want to revise their characters. After all, these are human beings that were born inside of our souls that we put down on the page, and how dare we change any aspect of these beautiful souls? So obviously you don't want your character fulfilling some sort of boring trope or cliche, but let's go a little bit deeper. What two questions should you ask when you are revising your character? These two questions are important, but seemingly contradictory. Number one, are these characters consistent throughout the novel? And number two, do these characters change over time? Do they have their own sort of narrative arcs? Through the crucible of conflict, characters change, identities and values shift. But you want to make sure that those changes make sense. You want to make sure that what is happening in your book, the plot, directly links to how your character changes over time. So there are plenty of characters in media that are super inconsistent and seem to change really quickly, and there are other characters who do change a lot, but that change makes sense. So take time to think about those narratives and think about why they work. And then consider how your characters can have a satisfying character arc rather than a disappointing one. Hi, this is a series about writers revising their novel, and we're almost at the end, so we're gonna get into the nitty-gritty, the little details, just like I promised. You address the plot, the structure, the characters, and now you're ready for those tiny details of craft. Here are some enumerated suggestions. 1. Ensure that your description uses concrete details. So for example, if you have the word flower, instead of just writing flower, write what kind of flower. It will just tell us that a character is drinking soda. Tell us that they are drinking cheerwine. Be precise in your world making. 2. Use all of your senses, not just your visuals, but your ears and your nose and your taste receptors and your phalanges. Use all of them. You got them all, so use them all. Number 3. When you're using figurative language, don't use cliches. So get rid of all the, it was hot as the sun or it was cold as ice. No! Be creative. I believe in you, you can do it. Number 4, limit modifiers. Adverbs are totally cool. They are like croutons. You can put some on your salad, that's totally fine. You don't gotta get rid of all the croutons, but if you have a salad that's just croutons, that's not a salad, that's just a loaf of bread. Very crunchy bread. Number 5, if you are describing an everyday moment, consider how you might make the ordinary unfamiliar and more interesting. Listen, I just don't want to read another first chapter that's all about morning routines. You get up, you take a shower, you brush your teeth. Either make that more interesting or just get rid of it. And finally, number 6, ask yourself this question. Is this self-indulgent? Is this description necessary? Do I really need a scene in which I just describe someone eating a tomato? If yes, totally leave it in. But if no, consider, deleting that paragraph, just putting it in another document, saving it for another day. You don't gotta delete it totally, but remove it from the story and it will improve your flow. Remember, you're trying to write the best possible story. Hi, this is a 10-part series about revising a novel. This is the final part where you actually do the thing that most people start with, which is copy editing. Now remember, if you're not a grammar savvy person, it might help at this point to hire a copy editor, but otherwise, here are some of the major mistakes: verb, noun, disagreement, misplaced or dangling modifier, missing commas, or more common, superfluous comma, a pronoun without a clear antecedent, ending a sentence with a preposition to, with a preposition, mixing up similar words, lack of parallel structure. If you are struggling to learn grammar rules, I'm going to give you 2 great resources. The first one is the Grammar Girl website. It's also a podcast. It is fantastic. Go check that out if you want to learn your grammar. And the second is I suggest that you buy a copy of Elements of Style by Strunk and White. I know it's a classic for a reason though. And here's the last thing I'll say about grammar and syntax. They are a framework through which we communicate. So if you want to break those rules, that's totally cool, but if you want to break them, you gotta know them. You gotta know why you're breaking them in the first place. Those linguistic deviations should serve your story rather than detract from them. And now that you've finished part 10, congratulations, you've revised your novel, and you've done so in the most radical and probably most difficult way possible. And don't worry, you're totally gonna have to rewrite it when you send it to the publisher. That's just part of the process. Don't worry about that right now. Happy querying.